The night stretched endlessly, as black and silent as the grave. The narrow, twisting road cut through the forest like a scar, swallowed on either side by looming trees. The air was thick, the kind of oppressive quiet that smothered every sound and made your breath seem too loud. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat, her eyes darting between the road and the nearly empty gas gauge. "Sam," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence, "we're almost out of gas." "I know," Sam muttered, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His knuckles whitened with each twist of the steering wheel. "There's supposed to be a station a few miles ahead." "That's what you said 10 miles ago," Kelly snapped from the back seat. She was hunched over her phone, repeatedly refreshing the map app that stubbornly refused to load. Still no signal. "This is fantastic. Maybe we should have taken the main highway," Mike added, smirking in the back seat. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the seat in front of him. "You know, like normal people." Sam shot him a glare in the rearview mirror. "Do you want to drive?" Mike shrugged. "Not like we're going anywhere." The car suddenly lurched, the engine coughing and sputtering before falling silent. The headlights flickered, then died, plunging the group into complete darkness. "You've got to be kidding me," Sam groaned, slamming his hands on the steering wheel. "Perfect," Kelly muttered, shoving her phone back into her bag. "Now what?" Sarah hesitated, her hand on the door handle. "We can't just stay here. Maybe there's a house nearby? Someone who can help?" Kelly let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh sure, let's just wander into the woods and knock on doors. Because that's not the beginning of every horror movie ever. Do you have a better idea?" Sarah snapped, her nerves finally fraying. "Guys," Sam interrupted, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Enough. Let's just see what's out there. If we find a house, great. If not, we'll come back to the car." Reluctantly, Kelly and Mike followed as Sam and Sarah stepped out into the night. The cold hit them immediately, biting and sharp, and their breaths fogged in the air. The forest seemed to press in on them from all sides, the towering trees casting long, jagged shadows. The only sound was the crunch of dead leaves underfoot as they moved cautiously down the road. "How is it this quiet?" Mike muttered, breaking the silence. "Shouldn't there be, like, crickets or something?" "No signal, no crickets," Kelly said dryly. "Maybe this whole place is cursed." "Shut up," Sarah hissed. "Do you see that?" She stopped abruptly, pointing ahead. In the distance, a faint, flickering light danced between the trees. It was barely visible, like the glow of a candle through fog. "Do you think it's a house?" Sam asked, squinting. "Or a trap," Mike muttered, earning a sharp elbow to the ribs from Kelly. The group moved cautiously toward the light, their footsteps growing slower as the shape of a large building emerged from the shadows. It was a mansion, old and decrepit, with peeling paint and ivy climbing its crumbling walls. The shutters hung askew, some barely clinging to their hinges, and the roofline sagged under its own weight. Yet the light in one of the upstairs windows burned steadily, as if beckoning them closer. "This place looks abandoned," Kelly whispered, her voice barely audible. "But someone's inside," Sarah said, taking a step forward. "We don't have a choice." Sam pushed open the rusted gate, the creak splitting the air like a scream. They made their way up the overgrown path to the front door. The house loomed over them, its dark windows like empty eyes. Sam hesitated before knocking, the sound dull and hollow against the wood. They waited. The door creaked open slowly, though no one stood on the other side. A wave of stale air hit them, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. "I don't like this," Kelly whispered, clutching Mike's arm. "Do you want to freeze out here?" Sam said, stepping inside. The others followed reluctantly. The interior was just as unsettling as the exterior. The wallpaper, once elegant, was now faded and peeling. A chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, its flickering light casting shifting shadows on the walls. The furniture was draped in dusty sheets, and cobwebs hung in thick curtains from the corners. Somewhere in the distance, a faint fire crackled. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the depths of the house, came a soft, raspy voice. "Gloomy, you must be cold." The group froze as an elderly woman emerged from the shadows. She was frail, her skin as pale as parchment, and her eyes glinted darkly in the dim light. She wore a long black dress, its hem trailing the dusty floor, and her smile was tight and unnatural. "Welcome," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been expecting you." The heavy door slammed shut behind them with a finality that made everyone jump. Kelly spun around, clutching Mike's arm, her eyes wide with fear. Did the wind do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No wind," Mike muttered, glancing at the still curtains in the corner. "That wasn't the wind." The old woman shuffled ahead of them, her footsteps eerily quiet on the worn floorboards. She motioned for them to follow her down a dimly lit hallway. "Come, my dears," she said, her voice dry and rasping like brittle leaves crumbling underfoot. "The night is cold, and you look so tired. You must warm yourselves." Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. But the others followed, and she reluctantly trailed behind them, clutching her arms tightly to her chest. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with faded wallpaper that was once a vibrant red but had dulled to the color of dried blood. Ornate wooden sconces hung along the walls, their candles flickering weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted like living things. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Sarah's stomach churn. "This place gives me the creeps," Kelly whispered to Mike, who nodded silently. At the end of the hallway, the woman led them into a sitting room. A weak fire crackled in the hearth, its light barely illuminating the room's tattered furniture. The chairs and sofa were draped with dusty sheets, and the large mirror above the fireplace was warped and cloudy, as though it had been submerged underwater. "Please," the woman said, gesturing to the seats. "Make yourselves comfortable." "Actually," Sarah began cautiously, "we just need a phone, or directions to the nearest town." The woman's dark eyes gleamed as she looked at Sarah. "There is no town nearby, not for miles, and no phone, I'm afraid. But the house will keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Mike asked, crossing his arms. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she shuffled to a side table and picked up a silver teapot. Its surface was tarnished, the delicate handle adorned with strange, swirling engravings. She poured steaming liquid into mismatched cups, handing them out one by one. "Drink," she said with a faint smile. "It will warm you." Sarah accepted the cup but didn't drink. The liquid was a murky brown, with an oily sheen on its surface. It smelled faintly metallic, like rusted iron. Sam, however, took a sip without hesitation. "Not bad," he said, though his voice was uneasy. "Kinda tastes like licorice?" Kelly and Mike hesitated, but eventually drank as well. Sarah placed her cup on a nearby table, her unease growing by the second. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Sarah asked, trying to sound calm. "Do you live here alone?" The woman sat down slowly, her thin fingers wrapped tightly around her own cup. She didn't answer at first, staring into the fire as if lost in thought. "This house," she said finally, "has been here longer than the trees, longer than the road you traveled." "That's not really an answer," Kelly said nervously, glancing at the mirror above the fireplace. Her reflection seemed distorted, the edges of her face stretching and warping like a funhouse image. "Do you see that?" she whispered, stepping closer to the mirror. "What are you talking about?" Mike asked, but as he turned to look, his expression froze. The reflections in the mirror weren't matching their movements. Sarah saw her own reflection turn its head slowly, though she hadn't moved. Its eyes were darker, empty, soulless, and its lips curled into a twisted smile. "What the hell is this?" Mike whispered, backing away. Before anyone could react, the fire in the hearth roared to life, flames leaping high and casting the room in blinding light. The group stumbled back, shielding their eyes. When the fire dimmed, the room was empty. The woman was gone. "Where did she go?" Sam asked, his voice shaky. "She was right here." The room seemed different now. The wallpaper, once dull and peeling, was vibrant and pristine, its swirling patterns of vines and flowers moving subtly, almost imperceptibly. The furniture, too, had transformed, no longer draped in dust but polished and inviting. The mirror above the fireplace gleamed, its surface smooth and perfect. "This is insane," Kelly said, clutching Mike's arm. "None of this makes sense." "We need to leave," Sarah said firmly. "Now!" The group rushed back to the hallway, but the entry door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the wood smooth and seamless as if no door had ever existed. "This can't be real," Kelly said, her voice rising in panic. She ran her hands over the wall, searching for any trace of a seam or handle. "It was here. We just came through here. It's the house," Mike said grimly. "It's messing with us." A deep, resonant creak echoed through the hallway, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and drawing closer. "Run," Sarah whispered, and the group bolted down the corridor. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, lined with identical doors. Some stood ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that defied logic. A ballroom with a chandelier as vast as the night sky, its crystals glinting like stars. A library whose shelves stretched infinitely upward, disappearing into darkness. Other doors remained tightly shut, their handles rattling violently as if something inside was trying to escape. "This isn't possible," Sam shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We're going in circles." "No," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "Look." She pointed to a small side table against the wall. On it sat the silver teapot from earlier, the cups still full and steaming. "We're not moving," she said, her voice trembling. "The house is." The hallway stretched on endlessly, each step heavier than the last. Sarah could feel the air thickening, pressing against her lungs like a weight. The walls seemed to close in, the flickering candlelight on the sconces dimming with each passing second. "This isn't real," Kelly muttered, her voice quivering. "This can't be real." "It's real enough," Sam snapped, his flashlight flickering as he swept it across the endless corridor. "And we need to find a way out." Mike stopped suddenly, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" Everyone froze, the silence suffocating. Then came the sound, a faint, wet squelching, like something being dragged across the floor. It grew louder, closer, echoing from somewhere deep in the house. "We're not sticking around to find out what that is," Sarah whispered. "Keep moving." The group hurried forward, their footsteps quick and uneven. Doors lined the walls on either side, some slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of impossible spaces. A dining room larger than a cathedral, its table piled with rotting food. A bedroom filled with dolls, each one staring at the door with lifeless eyes. "Don't look," Sarah warned, pulling Kelly away from one of the open doors. "It's trying to distract us." "What is it?" Kelly demanded, her voice cracking. "The house," Sarah said, her tone grim. "Or whatever's controlling it." Ahead, the hallway split into two paths, each equally dark and foreboding. "Which way?" Sam asked, his flashlight flickering out entirely. "Left," Sarah said without hesitation. She couldn't explain why, but something in her gut told her the right path was worse. The group turned left, the walls narrowing as the air grew colder. Their breaths fogged in front of them, and the wet sound of dragging grew louder, following them like an unseen predator. Kelly stumbled, clutching Mike's arm for support. I don't feel so good," she mumbled. "None of us do," Mike said, his voice unusually gentle. "But we have to keep going." They reached another door, this one slightly ajar with faint light spilling out. Unlike the others, it didn't exude the same sense of dread. "Maybe there's something in here," Sarah said. "Something to help us." Sam pushed the door open cautiously. Inside was a small study, its walls lined with bookshelves filled with cracked, yellowed tomes. A desk sat in the center, covered in papers and a single lit candle. "This is normal," Mike said, stepping inside. "Relatively speaking." Sarah scanned the room, her eyes falling on a large, leather-bound book lying open on the desk. The pages were covered in strange symbols, and the ink seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the candlelight. Don't touch it, Kelly said, grabbing Sarah's arm. I don't care how curious you are. Just don't. But something about the book called to Sarah, an insistent whisper in the back of her mind. She shook it off, stepping away from the desk. Let's just keep moving. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. What the hell? Sam yelled, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. The light in the room dimmed, the candle's flame shrinking until it was barely more than a flicker. Shadows gathered in the corners, twisting and writhing like living things. Kelly, Mike said suddenly. Where's Kelly? The group turned, their hearts sinking. She was gone. She was right here, Sarah said, panic rising in her chest. Kelly! No response. The room seemed to breathe, the walls pressing inward as the shadows grew darker. Then came a sound, a faint, distant scream, cut off abruptly. We have to get out of here, Mike said, his voice trembling. Now! The door finally gave way, slamming open as if pushed by an unseen force. The hallway beyond was no longer the same. The walls were bare wood now, the wallpaper stripped away to reveal splintered boards oozing a dark, tar-like substance. The air was colder, and the oppressive silence had returned. She's still here, Sarah said firmly. We're not leaving without her. Do you think she's alive? Mike asked, his voice hollow. You heard that scream. Sarah glared at him. We don't know anything, and we're not abandoning her. The group moved cautiously down the new hallway, which twisted and turned unpredictably, as if the house was deliberately leading them somewhere. The flickering light of their flashlight barely cut through the gloom. Do you feel that? Sam whispered. Sarah nodded. The air was thick with a low, thrumming vibration, like the heartbeat of something massive. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a steady, rhythmic pulse. This place is alive, Sarah said quietly. It's watching us. They reached another door, this one much larger and more ornate than the others. It was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when they weren't looking directly at them. Despite their fear, they pushed it open. Inside was a vast, circular room. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one taller than a person and framed in black and silver. The air was colder here, biting and sharp. At the center of the room stood an enormous mirror, its surface smooth and perfect. But the reflections weren't right. Sarah stared at her own image, which stared back with cold, lifeless eyes. Her reflection raised a hand, touching the glass, but Sarah hadn't moved. This isn't real, Mike said, backing away. It's just a trick. The reflections began to move on their own, each one stepping closer to the glass. Their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their eyes glinting with malice. Don't look at them, Sarah warned, grabbing Mike's arm. Just don't. But it was too late. Mike's reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. A spiderweb of cracks spread across the mirror, and with a deafening crash, it shattered. The room plunged into darkness, and the group was thrown to the floor by a force they couldn't see. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was alone. When Sarah opened her eyes, the silence was deafening. The floor beneath her was cold and hard, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and decay. She sat up slowly, her head pounding, and realized with a sinking feeling that she was completely alone. The room with the mirrors was gone, replaced by a vast, empty corridor lit only by faintly glowing lines etched into the floor. They pulsed rhythmically, like veins carrying the lifeblood of the house. Sunk. Sarah called out, her voice trembling. Mike, Kelly. Her words echoed hollowly, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. There was no response, only the steady thrumming from the walls, growing louder with each passing second. The lines on the floor pulsed in time with the sound, leading forward into the unknown. Keep it together, she whispered to herself, gripping her flashlight tightly. You'll find them. She forced herself to her feet and began following the glowing lines. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting and bending as if alive. Her flashlight's beam flickered, the light dimming each time she tried to focus on a specific detail. She felt the house watching her, its unseen eyes crawling over her skin. As Sarah walked, Faint whispers began to drift through the air. At first, they were barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But soon they grew louder, distinct words forming, though she couldn't understand the language. The voices overlapped, creating a chaotic, discordant symphony that filled her head. "Stop," she whispered, pressing her hands to her ears. "Just stop." The whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew sharper, angrier, as if they were aware of her resistance. Shadows began to flicker along the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that moved just out of the corner of her eye. Sarah quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The corridor seemed to narrow, the walls closing in around her. The glowing lines on the floor pulsed faster, urging her forward. Ahead, she saw a door. It was massive, its surface carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The whispers intensified as she approached, the voices screaming now, their words filled with fury and malice. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. "What's behind here?" she muttered, half to herself. "Do I even want to know?" But the lines on the floor led directly to the door, and there was no other path. Summoning her courage, she gripped the handle and pushed. The door opened into a circular chamber bathed in a deep, blood-red light. The walls were covered in symbols, similar to those on the door, but far more elaborate, their glowing lines seething like living things. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested the same ornate mirror she had seen in the sitting room. But this mirror was different. Its surface shimmered like water, rippling as though something inside was trying to break free. "Sarah." The voice came from the mirror, soft and distorted. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. "Sarah, come closer." She shook her head, stepping back. "No, no way." The voice shifted, becoming familiar. "Sarah, it's me. It's Sam." Her breath caught in her throat. "Sam, where are you?" "In here," the voice said clearer now. "I'm trapped. You have to help me." She hesitated, her instincts screaming that this was a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if Sam really was inside the mirror, waiting for her to save him? Cautiously, she stepped closer. The mirror's surface rippled, and Sam's face appeared, his expression filled with fear. His hand pressed against the glass. "Please," he said. "I don't know how much time I have." Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the mirror's surface. The glass was cold and unyielding at first, but then it seemed to soften, pulling her hand inside. The moment her fingers breached the surface, a searing pain shot through her arm. She screamed, trying to pull back, but the mirror wouldn't let go. It dragged her forward, the rippling surface now churning violently. "Sarah," the voice shouted, but it wasn't Sam's anymore. It was deeper, crueler, filled with malice. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, throwing her backward. She hit the ground hard, her arm burning with pain. When she looked up, the room was empty. The pedestal was gone, the mirror reduced to shards that glittered like bloodied ice. The symbols on the walls began to pulse erratically, and the ground trembled beneath her. Sarah scrambled to her feet, clutching her arm, and ran back toward the door. She could feel the house shifting around her, its anger palpable. The corridor beyond was no longer empty. It was filled with objects, furniture, photographs, and toys, strewn haphazardly along the floor. Sarah stumbled over an old rocking horse, its paint peeling and eyes staring blankly at nothing. She picked up one of the photographs, her breath catching in her throat. It showed a family, parents and 2 children, standing in front of the mansion. The woman in the picture was unmistakable. It was the old woman who had greeted them. "They lived here," Sarah whispered. But what happened to them? A sudden noise behind her made her spin around. The rocking horse was moving, its slow, rhythmic creak cutting through the silence. She backed away, her flashlight flickering wildly. The whispers returned, louder now, forming a single word: "Stay." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not staying." The corridor twisted, bending impossibly as the walls seemed to fold in on themselves. She ran blindly, her only goal to escape the suffocating grip of the house. But no matter how far she ran, The end of the corridor always seemed just out of reach. Finally, she burst into a large room she didn't recognize. It was empty except for a single figure standing in the center. "Kelly!" Sarah cried, relief flooding her voice. "You're alive!" Kelly turned slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. When she spoke, her voice was layered with something inhuman. "You should have left, Sarah, but now it's too late." Before Sarah could respond, the door slammed shut behind her. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality, plunging the room into a tense, heavy silence. Sarah stared at Kelly, who stood motionless in the center of the room. Her friend's face was wrong, pale, almost translucent, with veins like dark rivers running beneath her skin. Her lips were slightly parted, and her eyes, black and endless, bore no resemblance to the Kelly Sarah knew. "Kelly," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "What happened to you? Where are the others?" Kelly tilted her head, the motion sharp and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. "The house has them now," she said, her voice layered with echoes, as if a dozen mouths spoke in unison. "Just as it has me." Sarah's knees buckled slightly, her back pressing against the wall. "No, this isn't real. You're still in there. I can help you." Kelly smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was a predator smile. "Help? You think you can help me? There is no me anymore. There's only us." Sarah froze. The words didn't make sense, but the malice in Kelly's voice was undeniable. The room began to shift around them, the walls stretching and warping. Shadows spilled from every corner, pooling on the floor and rising like smoke. "You need to run," Kelly whispered, her voice dropping to a low, guttural growl. "Run, Sarah, before we take you too." Sarah didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the nearest door, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, Kelly, or whatever she had become, let out a guttural shriek that echoed through the house. The shadows surged forward, snapping at Sarah's heels like wild animals. The hallway she entered was narrow and uneven, its floorboards creaking under her weight. Doors lined the walls, some open, others rattling violently, as if something inside was trying to get out. The house groaned and shifted, the walls closing in and forcing her forward. She reached another intersection, this one splitting into 3 identical corridors. A faint light glimmered at the end of the leftmost path, and she sprinted toward it, praying it would lead to safety. Behind her, the shrieks grew louder, accompanied by the sickening sound of wet footsteps slapping against the floor. Faster, she urged herself, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The light at the end of the corridor wasn't salvation. It led to another room, larger than the others. A grand staircase spiraled upward into darkness, its steps cracked and covered in dust. At the base of the stairs stood a figure. Sarah cried out, relief flooding her chest. Sam turned slowly, but like Kelly, something was wrong. His eyes glowed faintly, and his movements were stiff, mechanical. "Sarah," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have stayed." "You're alive," she said, stepping toward him. "We can get out of here. Together." Sam raised a hand, palm outward, stopping her. "It won't let us leave. It needs us. And now, it needs you." The shadows surged into the room, curling around the walls and pooling at the base of the staircase. Sarah backed away, her eyes darting between Sam and the encroaching darkness. "What do you mean it needs us?" she asked, her voice shaking. Sam's face twitched, as if struggling against some unseen force. "The house is alive. It's feeding. It takes us, our memories, our fears, our lives. And it makes us part of it." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "We can fight it. We can get out." "You don't understand," Sam said, his voice breaking slightly. "Once it has a piece of you, it never lets go." The shadows crept closer, twisting into unnatural shapes. Long arms with clawed fingers, empty faces with mouths that gaped impossibly wide. Sarah turned to run, but the doorway she had entered through was gone, replaced by a smooth, unbroken wall. "Sarah," Sam said, his voice soft now, almost pleading, Don't let it take you. Then help me, she cried. I can't, he replied, his glowing eyes flickering. I'm already gone. The shadows surged forward, and Sarah had no choice but to run up the staircase. Each step groaned under her weight, threatening to collapse, but she pressed on, the darkness snapping at her heels. The staircase spiraled endlessly, and the air grew thinner the higher she climbed. Her legs burned, her breaths came in shallow gasps, but she refused to stop. Behind her, the shrieks and whispers grew louder, an incomprehensible cacophony that burrowed into her mind. Finally, she reached the top. A single door stood before her, its surface plain and unremarkable. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. There was no telling what lay beyond, but there was no going back. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast and cavernous, its walls lined with pulsating veins of dark, glowing light. In the center of the room stood an altar, and on it rested the mirror. Its surface was no longer smooth and reflective but alive, rippling like a pool of black water. Sarah stepped closer, drawn to the mirror despite her fear. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Sarah, one voice called. It was Kelly's. Another joined it, rough and desperate. Sarah, help me. Some. Then came a third voice, soft and broken. Don't listen to them. Sarah froze. The third voice was her own. Her reflection appeared in the mirror, staring back at her with dark, empty eyes. It smiled, its lips curling unnaturally wide. You belong here, it said, its voice echoing in her mind. You've always belonged here. No, Sarah whispered, stepping back. I'm not part of this. The mirror rippled violently, and shadows erupted from its surface, coiling toward her like living chains. She turned to run, but the altar's edge caught her foot, sending her crashing to the ground. The shadows wrapped around her wrists and ankles, pulling her toward the mirror. Let me go, she screamed, struggling against their grip. I won't stay here. The mirror's surface began to change, showing images of her life, her childhood home, her friends, her memories. The house was consuming her, piece by piece. Sarah's hand brushed against something cold and sharp on the floor, a shard of the broken mirror from earlier. Gripping it tightly, she turned and drove it into the nearest shadow. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek, recoiling. Fueled by desperation, Sarah slashed at the other shadows, forcing them to release her. The mirror rippled violently, its surface cracking and splintering. No, the voices screamed. You can't leave. You belong to us. Ignoring them, Sarah raised the shard and drove it into the mirror's surface. The glass shattered, the sound deafening. Light erupted from the mirror, blinding and searing, and the entire room began to shake. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went black was her own reflection, smiling as it dissolved into the light. Sarah awoke on the cold, hard ground. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The air was still, heavy with the faint metallic scent that had clung to the house from the beginning. Slowly, she opened her eyes and sat up. The room was gone. She was back in the hallway, or at least what remained of it. The once twisting corridor was now in ruins, its walls crumbling, revealing nothing but an infinite black void beyond. The glowing lines on the floor were faint now, pulsing weakly as if the house itself was dying. Sam? Kelly? Mike? She called out, her voice echoing into the emptiness. There was no answer, only silence. Sarah staggered to her feet, clutching her side. She could barely move, but she forced herself forward, the weak, pulsing light guiding her steps. Each breath felt heavier, as though the house still clung to her, trying to pull her back. After what felt like hours of walking, Sarah saw something ahead, a faint light breaking through the darkness. Her heart leaped. It was the first sign of hope she'd seen since entering the house. The light grew stronger as she approached, and soon she realized it was coming from a door, an ordinary wooden door, plain and unremarkable. It stood alone, unsupported by walls or a frame, its edges glowing softly. Beyond it, she could see the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Her pulse quickened. Freedom. She was so close. Sarah reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling. But as soon as she touched it, a cold voice echoed behind her. "You can't leave." She froze, her hands still on the handle. Slowly, she turned. The hallway was no longer empty. Kelly stood at the far end, her face pale and hollow, her eyes black voids. Behind her was Sam, his body rigid and his expression blank. And then Mike emerged, his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You belong to us now," Kelly said, her voice layered with malice. "The house never lets go." "No," Sarah whispered, gripping the handle tightly. "I'm not staying here." The figures moved toward her, their footsteps slow but deliberate. Shadows oozed from their bodies, spreading across the floor like ink. The air grew colder, and the faint light from the door flickered. "Sarah," Sam said, his voice hollow and distant. "Don't fight it. You can't win." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You're not real. None of this is real." The shadows lunged at her, clawing and pulling, their touch icy and suffocating. Sarah screamed, her body trembling as the darkness wrapped around her limbs, trying to drag her away from the door. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah wrenched the door open. Light flooded the hallway, blinding and warm, and the shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing. The figures of her friends flickered, their forms distorting and breaking apart like shattered glass. "Sarah," Kelly's voice called, soft now, almost pleading. "Don't leave us." But Sarah didn't look back. She stepped through the door. The forest was silent and still, bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. The cool air filled her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe freely. The door behind her slammed shut, and when she turned, it was gone. Only the dense trees remained, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body trembling. She was free. She was alive. But as she sat there, staring into the forest, a nagging thought gnawed at the edges of her mind. She remembered the voices, the images of her friends, and their final words. "They're still in there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Some, Kelly, Mike." She stood slowly, her legs shaking. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, and the road she had come from was nowhere to be seen. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had no idea where she was. As Sarah wandered through the forest, trying to find her way back to civilization, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The trees seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, their branches whispering softly in the breeze. Hours passed, and the light of dawn faded into the dim gray of overcast skies. Just as she was about to give up hope, she stumbled onto a familiar sight. The car. It was parked exactly where they had left it, its hood still open, and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. "Is this real?" she murmured, stepping closer. The car looked untouched, as though no time had passed since they had abandoned it. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and a faint sound drifted from within, static, like a radio struggling to find a signal. Sarah leaned inside, her fingers brushing the dashboard. The keys were still in the ignition, but the gas gauge now read full. Her heart pounded as she reached for the keys, turning them hesitantly. The engine roared to life, and the radio crackled before a familiar voice came through. "Sarah." Her blood turned to ice. It was Kelly's voice, soft and distant, filled with static. "Sarah, you can't leave us." The static grew louder, drowning out the voice, and the air inside the car grew cold. Panicking, Sarah shoved the door open and stumbled out, her eyes darting around the forest. The trees were still. The wind had stopped, but the faint sound of whispers carried through the air, growing louder with each passing second. She backed away from the car, her chest heaving. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening as the whispers became a chorus. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, stood the house. It was intact, its windows glowing faintly, as if waiting for her to return. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, I'm free." The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, haunting symphony. The forest seemed to shift, the path behind her vanishing as the house loomed closer. Sarah ran, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. But no matter how far she went, the house was always there, waiting at the edge of her vision. Sarah's scream echoed through the forest, but no one was there to hear it. The house always wins. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.